Please be seated. The court is back in session. Again, the floor is given to international co-prosecutor to put further questions to the expert.
Professor, I'm interested because you talked about interviews you had with Ieng Sary in the 1980s, I believe. Did you discuss this topic with him at all, the Democratic Kampuchea's attacks into Vietnam during the DK regime?
No, I don't recall discussing that. Just one question which stood out to me was that I asked him who were the most influential people in his politically influential people in world history, and the first person he mentioned was Mao Zedong. I will also add that he added, as a sop to the American television network, Ronald Reagan. So, no, I don't recall him making any comment on this particular thing.
I believe you said that was an ABC?
CBS.
CBS, excuse me, interview. Do you know, was it broadcast?
No, it was never broadcast.
You also mentioned that you spoke to the King Father. Can you tell us a little bit about that conversation?
That was in Ban Sen, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, Thailand, in 1985. I mainly engaged the King Father, the late King Father, in discussions of historical questions rather than contemporary events, about his relationships towards various political figures in the world, and towards the United States. That lasted for about 90 minutes.
Did you recall if you discussed with him his relationship with the group that he named, the Khmer Rouge?
No, I don't recall discussing that with him. I may have discussed, but nothing that was said was exceptional. What stays in my mind were things that were exceptional in the conversation. So he may have said things, but he thanked me at the end of the meeting for not discussing contemporary political events and only discussing historical events, which he said he found very interesting.
Okay. So you did not discuss, I gather from that last answer, why he was at that moment working with the remnants of the DK regime to fight against the Vietnamese occupation of the country.
No, I don't recall that part of it. But again, if we did discuss it, the reason I won't recall it is because it would have been the comments would have been obvious to me, nothing new. What stands in my mind was what he told me that was new to me, new information, which there were some significant examples of. But with regard to, I knew that he had a tactical alliance with the Khmer Rouge to repel the Vietnamese invasion of the country.
And you have described him.
Please hold on, and please switch off your microphone after you put the question to the expert, and also leave a slight pause between the question and answer session.
Thank you, Mr. President. I will. You described the King Father as a practical and realistic man. Can you explain what you mean by that?
What I mean by that is that he had a set of political goals and tried to achieve them as best possible in the most practical way. That is, he wanted to keep Cambodia independent, and therefore he pursued policies which he thought would achieve that end. I brought this up because I wanted to contrast it with the policies of DK, which I felt were not practical.
Do you wish to expand on that, to make that clear? What is the difference?
Basically, the prince, or he was then the prince, by the way. The late King Father was then a titled Prince Sihanouk. As I think I mentioned in some of the earlier comments that I made to Nguyen Chia's representative, he represented. He understood that there was a hostility from Vietnam towards the Cambodians, or at least a condescending, patronizing attitude, that Vietnam had imperial orientations, but he understood he had to do everything he could to prevent those ambitions from being realized, and that included not provoking the Vietnamese. And I draw that contrast with what I saw as the behavior of Pol Pot and some of the leaders of Democratic Kampuchea, which were provocative.
You also said that the King Father, or Prince Sihanouk at the time, was not a racist. How would you contrast that with the DK?
I think that I'm not quite sure what the real attitudes of the DK were towards non-Khmer ethnic groups, because the DK was really in the tradition of totalitarian revolutionary movements, like the Soviet Communist Party, like the Chinese Communist Party. And their ambition was to eradicate cultural differences in society. So it wasn't because they necessarily specifically hated Vietnamese or specifically hated other ethnic groups, but because ethnic differentiation was an obstacle to a kind of social conformity and a social monolith which they wanted to create. So I would say that, somebody once told me that they often frequently, in the period in recent years before his arrest, Ieng Sary was often seen eating at a Vietnamese restaurant in Phnom Penh. I suspect that he wasn't particularly hostile to Vietnamese. But they were an obstacle to ambitions.
Okay, I'm going to switch topics a bit rather than go into more depth on that. And I'd like to read to you from some other authors who talk about Vietnamese views of Khmer Rouge leaders, DK leadership. And perhaps I'll start with Dmitry Mosyakov. And this is at E3/9644. ERN is 010 85974 to the next page in English. In French, 011-25304, and in Khmer at 011-20075. First of all, you know Mr. Masyakov. Can you explain a little bit about him and your relationship with him?
Mr. Masyakov was a Russian scholar at the Institute of Oriental Studies in Moscow when I met him. He's an expert in Cambodian affairs, and I hired him as an assistant in my research in order to be what I have said earlier was a kind of screener of documents for me to provide me with make a decision about what documents were the most relevant to my research. I gave him a lot of leeway in terms of time, and he spent some of his time doing his own research in the archives while I was there. Pertaining to Cambodia.
On this page, he indicates that Pol Pot introduced Nun Chea, a person trusted in Hanoi, whom Le Duan, leader of the Vietnamese communists, in a conversation with the Soviet ambassador, called a politician of, quote, pro-Vietnam orientation, unquote, as the occupant of the second most important post in the party. Speaking of Nun Chea, Le Duan literally emphasized, quote, "He is our man indeed, and my personal friend," unquote. And the footnote indicates that this was a record of the Soviet ambassador with Le Duan, dated November 16, 1976. He goes on to say several pages later, ERN in Khmer 011-20098-99, in French 011-25322, and in English 010-85999. He said in October 1978, according to a high-ranking Vietnamese party official responsible for Cambodia, Hanoi still believed that there were two prominent party figures in Phnom Penh who sympathized with Vietnam, Nun Chea and the former First Secretary of the Eastern Zone, Sao Pim. Friends were aware, a Soviet diplomat reported, that Nun Chea opposes Pol Pot's regime. He deeply sympathizes with the CPV, but fearing reprisals, he cannot speak his mind. And then the last from Masyakov on the next page. It's the same ERN in French, one more in Khmer, and one more in English. He said, Vietnamese hopes that these figures would head an uprising against Pol Pot turned out to be groundless. Sao Pim perished in the revolt in June '78, while Nun Chea, as it is known, turned out to be one of the most devoted followers of Pol Pot. It is difficult to understand why, until the end of 1978, it was believed in Hanoi that Nun Chea was their man, in spite of the fact that all previous experience should have proved quite the contrary. Was Hanoi unaware of his permanent siding with Pol Pot? His demands that, quote, the Vietnamese minority should not be allowed to reside in Kampuchea, unquote, his extreme cruelty, as well as the fact that in comparison with Nun Chea, people considered Pol Pot a paragon of kindness. Now, what I'm interested in, Sir Professor, is your view of what we can take from these Soviet archives and the Vietnamese apparent view at the time that Nun Chea was sympathetic to their position and in opposition to Pol Pot, which I can say for all parties present in the courtroom, and anyone can tell me if I'm wrong, none of us believe is true, that the Vietnamese had that completely wrong. So what does that say to you about whether the Vietnamese had, in fact, good intelligence, had, in fact, penetrated the leadership of the CPK to know what was really going on within the CPK?
I think it tells us that the Vietnamese had very poor intelligence about what was going on in the leadership of the DK, and may have had poor intelligence even more broadly about what was going on in the countryside.
Now, the accused persons, Khieu Samphan and Nguyen Chea, have said that there were traitors and Vietnamese agents even within the Central Committee and the Standing Committee. What does this tell you about whether this makes sense, given that Vietnam thought that Nguyen Chea was their closest friend?
Well, I think it certainly raises questions about the reality of that belief, that there were enemies at such a high level of the Communist Party of Cambodia. I certainly, again, I would like to go back to a point that I've made earlier. This belief of enemies penetrating the party at the highest level was a feature of the Soviet Communist Party, it was a feature of the Chinese Communist Party, the Korean Communist Party. In their internal purges and terror campaigns, the supreme leader would always use such justifications, and he may have actually believed them, but use such justifications for a campaign of terror within the party leadership.
Would you agree that that, of course, differed over time and with leaderships? So with Stalin, it may have been different than with subsequent leaders. With the Lin Biao, I believe it was, campaign in China, differed from other periods under Deng Xiaoping, for example.
Yes, it's a product of a paranoid mindset, which is a characteristic of revolutionary elites. It certainly wasn't a characteristic of the mindset of Deng Xiaoping.
Thank you. Now, you had mentioned that Nguyen Chea had been in Vietnam, and there's a couple of quotes from the book Behind the Killing Fields I'd like to read to you and then get your comment. And this is E3/4202. In English, it's 00757-511. In Khmer, 00858-293. In French, 00849-403. It indicates, quote, that Nguyen Chea was the main Khmer Rouge liaison with the Vietnamese during Cambodia's civil war. Since he had traveled to Vietnam in 1953 for training, he knew the personalities of his Vietnamese counterparts, which made him the ideal negotiator. I am the compromiser, and I was close to Nguyen Van Linh, and we could talk easily, Nguyen Chea said. And then the second quote is at ERN in Khmer 00858-279, in French 849-394, and in English 00757-506. This is, in the book, they quote Nguyen Chea as saying, I liked reading books about how to work in secret and Vietnamese books that talked about the torture and arrest of communist members. So what can you tell us about what Nguyen Chea was doing in Vietnam and his relationship with the Vietnamese?
I can't tell you a lot about it. I can tell you very little, but he would have been one of the leading figures trained by the Vietnamese in the early 1950s, and therefore would have had a certain relationship with them, favorable relationship with them from their point of view, because the Vietnamese always believed that the people they trained would remain loyal to them. This has turned out to be false, as in the case of, for example, Pen Savan is one obvious example. But I think that Nguyen Chia, because of his pedigree in the Indo-Chinese Communist movement, would have been favorably treated by the Vietnamese. And it's the reason for their misinterpretation of his attitudes towards Vietnam.
What can you tell us about the relationship between this movement that Sihanouk called the Khmer Rouge, the Communist Party, they weren't called that then, but starting, as you know, in 1968, they began an armed rebellion against the government of Sihanouk. I believe that government also had been elected and against the monarchy. What was the relationship at that time between 1968 and the coup in 1970 between the Khmer Rouge and the Vietnamese?
The Khmer Rouge and Vietnamese had different objectives between 1968 and 1970 because the Khmer Rouge, as you've stated correctly, wanted to overthrow the government of then Prince Sihanouk, whilst the Vietnamese wanted to keep him in power because he was allowing them to use Cambodia as a staging area and as a supply base through Sihanoukville for their war in South Vietnam. That is, the Vietnamese communists were very favorably disposed towards retention of the Sihanouk government. And so there was a conflict of interest between the Khmer Rouge, who are based in the northeast of Cambodia, in the mountainous provinces of the northeast, and the Vietnamese, who in eastern parts of Cambodia, a little bit, some of which were a bit further south.
For the years between, let's say, 1968 and 1972, so that includes 2 years before the coup and 2 years after, did the Khmer Rouge seek the assistance of the Vietnamese, and did they receive any?
Well, they would have been supported by the Vietnamese at that time, especially from 1970 to 1972. After the coup d'etat of March 1970 by Lon Nol and Sirik Martak, the Vietnamese communists, who had been told by Lon Nol to get out of Cambodia, launched a series of offensives in late March of 1970 against the Lon Nol government, and then subsequently expanded the war into Cambodia more generally. As I said before, the Vietnamese were previously mostly in the eastern provinces of Cambodia. After the American and South Vietnamese invasion of April 1970, they fled into the interior of Cambodia. And in their wake, they set up Cambodian communist organizational structures, which they tried to dominate by their own Khmer-trained agents, which which were called the Khmer Viet Minh, the people who were brought back from Hanoi at that time. But Pol Pot and the other leaders of the Khmer Rouge were aware of this strategy of the Vietnamese and had the Khmer Viet Minh removed from positions of power in the communist structure. So that, in other words, what was happening in 1970 to 72 was that the Vietnamese communists were assisting the Khmer Rouge to establish themselves by providing a lot of military force against Lon Nol.
And for the time after the coup until the 17th of April, where did the Khmer Rouge forces obtain their arms and ammunition?
They obtained their arms and ammunition mostly from China, and that would have come, some of it would have come down the Ho Chi Minh Trail and be provided technically by the Vietnamese, but it was Chinese arms.
Thank you. So now I want to switch topics a bit and talk about the DK claims about Vietnamese agents within their ranks and the reasons for arrests and executions. Michael Vickery is a academic. Do you know him?
I do know of him, yes.
He's frequently cited by the defense in this case. But he wrote in E3 1757, and the ERN is only, this portion is only in English, 00396-945. He says, of the DK leadership, Ieng Sary and Salazar Pol Pot, in particular, never were pro-Vietnamese, and they became increasingly anti-Vietnamese as time went on, while those who were in any degree at all pro-Vietnamese were mercilessly eliminated between 1975 and 79. You wrote in your book on page 106, that's English ERN 01001773. There is no evidence that the people whom Pol Pot's emissaries attempted to kill were agents of Vietnam. On the contrary, the people Pol Pot was now attempting to kill had loyally carried out orders from the Khmer Rouge leadership for the previous 3 years. These orders had involved them attacking Vietnamese and ethnic Cambodian civilian targets inside Vietnam and bearing the brunt of Vietnamese retaliation. Just to provide all the quotes and get one question. Elizabeth Becker, in her book at E3/20, ERN English 00237-970, Khmer ERN 00232-350, and French ERN 00638-524, and on to the next page. She wrote that about the same year, 1976, she's talking about 1976, in the midst of this chaos, the Eastern Zone Army was ordered to the border to push back encroaching Vietnamese troops. After several skirmishes, the center rebuked Sao Pim, the Eastern Zone leader, for fighting the Vietnamese too zealously and warned him not to upset the tenuous balance on the border. She goes on to say on another page, and that is English 00238002, Khmer 00232, and French 0063855. She said, referring to Sao Pim, he was too much a part of the system to imagine it turning against him or to recognize the clues when the center did turn on him. He was a party elder. He had been a member of the elite standing committee since the 1950s. He had been party secretary of the Eastern Zone since 1960. He had personally built up the Eastern Zone Army. And on the next page he says, yet when Pol Pot ordered the execution of the Khmer Communists who returned from Hanoi with the Vietnamese troops, Pim obeyed. Eastern Zone deputies like Uk Pun Chun oversaw the detention and execution of the returnees within their region in 1974. But nowhere in this record is there a hint of Sao Pim being a close friend of Vietnam. Rather, he was proud of his record of refusing to become dependent on Vietnam in war or peace. Nor was there a hint of rebellion. So I'd like you to comment on what these other writers have written, and also I didn't read all of the excerpts in your book. Was there a rational belief by the DK leaders that their ranks were riven with traitors and agents of Vietnam?
In the period of the war against the Lon Nol government, I think it was true that there were agents of Vietnam within the Kampuchean Communist Party, and that Pol Pot was correct in thinking so. Not all the Khmer Viet Minh, as I want to reiterate, not all of the people trained in Hanoi were loyal to Hanoi, turned out to be loyal to Hanoi, but there were a substantial number who were, and who could have been considered to be compliant with Hanoi's interests in Indochina. However, most of these people had been killed by 1975, and therefore the purges and terror campaign, or campaigns which took place after 1975, were aimed at people who were loyal members of the system. I believe that it was a paranoid fantasy on the part of Pol Pot to think that people within the party who had been loyal to the party throughout a long period of time were in fact agents of Vietnam. Instead, I think it was not only paranoia, but also an attempt to explain weakness in conflict with Vietnam. In other words, the people like in the Eastern Zone who took the brunt of the fighting of Vietnam and who were not successful in their fighting with Vietnam must have been traitorous in order not to defeat Vietnam. Again, this is a part of a paranoid political culture which permeates all revolutionary movements.
Are there other examples of such regimes where they blame their own failures on sabotage, traitors within their ranks?
Certainly, Stalin's regime did that, and so did Mao's regime.
I'd like to read to you something that is written by Chanda, where he's quoting Stephen Heder. And this is E3/2376. In English, it's 00192380. In Khmer, 00191527. And in French, 00237 06324. He said, in light of what happened since the massacres in Tay Ninh, it has also become clear that it was no isolated act of madness. The attack on the eve of Pol Pot's first official trip to China was clearly aimed at impressing on China the seriousness of Cambodia's determination to fight Vietnam. American scholar Stephen Heder believes that the September 24th attack on Tay Ninh, launched by Divisions 3 and 4 of Cambodia's eastern zone, was a double gift. At a time when a countrywide hunt for suspected Vietnamese sympathizers was on, the Eastern Zone leaders' zeal in killing Vietnamese was proof of loyalty to Pol Pot, as well as an offering for him to carry to Beijing. Do you think there is some logic in Heder's belief that the Eastern Zone's participation in these killing of Vietnamese civilians was partially aimed to prove their loyalty to Pol Pot?
Yes, I agree.
Let me ask you a little bit about the relationship between democratic Kampuchea and the Soviet Union, and then then we'll go into China and the Soviet Union. Do you know what happened on the 17th of April when the Khmer Rouge took Phnom Penh to the Soviet embassy?
Yes, I believe that the Khmer Rouge fired a missile into the Soviet embassy.
Can you explain what the relations were and why the state of relations was as they were?
The relations were poor because the Soviet Union had not broken relationship with the Lon Nol government. That's the first reason. And I think the second reason is that the Khmer Rouge, being Maoist in their orientation, regarded the Soviet Union as a revisionist power. That's a bad word amongst Marxist-Leninist purists. To call somebody a revisionist means you're abandoning some of the fundamental principles of Marxism-Leninism. And I believe that that's how they regarded the Soviet Union. So there was a double set of factors, two factors which would have compelled them to be hostile towards the Soviet Union.
And what about the relationship in this time period between China and the Soviet Union? Can you talk about that? And the period I'm talking about is the decay period from 1975 to 79, but you can explain earlier events that affected that relationship.
Yes, relationships between the Soviet Union and China were extremely bad. They had hit rock bottom in 1969 when the Soviets actually threatened to take action, launch an attack against Chinese military installations, which they did not do, in part because of a warning from the United States not to do it. But the relationships continued to sour throughout the 1970s. And the Chinese regarded the Soviet Union as an expansionist power, which was intending to surround China strategically, and that Vietnam was one of the instruments of Soviet policy, Cuba being the other one. From 1975 to 1978, I think that the Soviet-Chinese relationship continued to get worse, and I think that the Khmer Rouge were still sympathetic to China in a total and overall sense until 1976 when Mao died. I think that their fervour for China as a nation diminished after the death of Mao. And the most loyal friend, the only country which the Khmer Rouge considered to be a good friend after 1976, was North Korea.
And do you put the change in the DK view towards China at the death of Mao, or the subsequent fall of the Gang of Four to Deng Xiaoping's eventual emergence? I think that was about a year later, was it?
Yes, I think, I'd restate it then. The Khmer Rouge became somewhat disillusioned with China as a result of the death of Maoism, which involved the Gang of Four.
And did, in fact, China and the Soviet Union actually have armed clashes over a dispute about where their border was?
Yes, they did.
So for China, how did they view the Vietnam's relationship with the Soviet Union?
China viewed Vietnam's relationship with the Soviet Union as a sign of ingratitude towards Chinese assistance over the whole history of the Vietnamese Communist movement, Chinese support for Vietnam over the entire history of the Vietnamese Communist movement. That was the first thing, and the second thing was that they regarded the Soviet Union as using Vietnam against China.
Did Vietnam and China have territorial disputes?
Yes, they did. Even during the period of before the fall of South Vietnam, there were disputes over the Paracel and Spratly Islands, disputes which continue to this day.
And can you briefly put on the record your view of the difference in the power, the military power of the Soviet Union and China at that time in the late 1970s?
Although China had nuclear weapons, the Soviet Union was a vastly superior military power, a global superpower. China was a regional power.
So in your view, would Chinese fear of encirclement by the Soviet Union, Soviet bases in Vietnam, be a rational view?
Yes, it was a rational fear.
And how then did the Chinese view Cambodia as how it played out in these various relationships between Vietnam, China, Soviet Union?
China regarded Cambodia as a possible buffer against Vietnamese expansion. And it should be noted that China has always had a special relationship with Cambodia, going back to the late King Father's rule when he was both king and then Prince Sihanouk.
want to ask you about something you wrote on page 72 of your book. The ERN is 01001739. You wrote, "Note Pol Pot's political judgment that building socialism quickly, which had already involved massacring hundreds of thousands of people, destroying their traditional culture and institutions, and creating second-class citizens out of the new people, would make Cambodia internally stronger and better able to deal with its external enemies. This judgment suggests a total disconnection from reality, which is clearly the product of paranoia and misguided ideological assumptions." You wrote on page 237, the ERN is 01001910, "Pol Pot's power within his party was never seriously challenged after 1972. And by 1977, his preemptive purges of the party and military had eliminated any possibility of a coup. Pol Pot's purges against non-existent enemies during 1978 further weakened his already weak political and military position in relation to his foreign enemies." Can you talk about that? Did the DK policies, particularly these internal purges of the East Zone Army and other setting up detention centers around the country, other Khmer DK policies, did they, in your view, help to assure the independence of Cambodia? Or did they make it more likely that Cambodia would lose its independence and actually weaken the country towards any potential foreign invader?
I believe the latter interpretation is correct. It severely weakened Cambodia's ability to engage in conflict with any neighbor, with the possible exception of Laos, with which Cambodia was not in conflict. I would like to point out, again, to use historical analogies, that this is a replication of kinds of behavior we see from revolutionary totalitarian dictators in the past. Stalin's, in the wake of the rise of Nazi Germany, Stalin purged not only his party leadership but also his military, and severely weakened the capability of the Soviet Union to face Nazi Germany. Similarly, in China, there were purges of the Chinese military at a time when China regarded the Soviet Union as a mortal threat to China. Mao Zedong carried out these terrorist purges against the armed forces leadership in a way which diminished his capability to deal with any possible future confrontation with the Soviet Union. So Pol Pot was in a way behaving just like the two giants of international communism in carrying out an internal purge against people whom he needed, and in fact in the general policy that he was pursuing, weakening the country's ability to resist Vietnam, if that's what he really thought was the main threat to Cambodia.
Well, in your view, were his policies aimed at strengthening the country against Vietnam or maintaining a small clique, his clique of leaders in power?
I believe the latter. Although he wanted to resist what he saw as the Vietnamese threat, what he was doing at the same time undermined his capability.
You've mentioned, I believe, this morning or perhaps it was yesterday afternoon, some historical attitudes of Khmer people towards Vietnam, a country that has much larger and that over the centuries has taken territory from what was previously part of the Khmer Empire. I'd like you to talk a little bit about further about that. In particular, how did during the Vietnam War, at the time of the 1970 coup, before and after that, how were the Vietnamese welcomed or not welcomed by the Khmer people inside Cambodia, the Vietnamese that were using bases in Cambodia? Yes, in the years before and after 1970.
The Vietnamese presence in Cambodia was not popular. It was not popular during the time of Sihanouk, which is one of the reasons why Sihanouk went overseas in early 1970 to try and convince the Soviets and the Chinese to get the Vietnamese out of Cambodia, the Vietnamese troops which were occupying the eastern zone of Cambodia. That was his mission when he was overthrown. Most Cambodian people are hostile towards the Vietnamese and would not have embraced any Vietnamese military presence in the country.
And would you say they would not have embraced then a Vietnamese invasion and capture of their capital before the Khmer Rouge?
Yes, I think that's correct.
And do you think that the Khmer Rouge, the DK policies, affected how what resistance there was to the eventual Vietnamese invasion? How it changed people's lives?
Yes, I think it affected the way they reacted. I think that the Cambodian people didn't want either a Vietnamese occupation of Cambodia nor a Khmer Rouge control of Cambodia, which is why in the elections which were held in 1993, a majority of Cambodians voted for the non-communist forces of the late Father King and of the Republican Party of the late Mr. Son San. Majority of people reject communism and they reject Vietnamese control of the country.
However, in this 70 to 75 war, there was, we can talk about it, a certain amount of popular support or support for the front, the opposition to Lon Nol, headed theoretically by Sihanouk. To what extent did Sihanouk's presence in that government affect the ability of the Khmer Rouge to gain popular support?
I think that Sihanouk's role, then Prince Sihanouk's role, was vital in helping the Khmer Rouge gain popular support. It should be noted, however, that there were royalist forces fighting against Lon Nol. There was a royalist army, though dwarfed by the rival communist factions. But I think that it was his political legitimacy which helped the Khmer Rouge, softened some of the opposition to the Khmer Rouge, which would otherwise have existed.
There is a something on that point that I wanted to bring up, but I can't find it now, but perhaps you recollect it. Maybe it was from your book. Do you recall in your any conversation with Sihanouk or reading about Sihanouk talking about badges with his picture being produced?
Yes, it was in my book. There were badges produced at the behest of I can't remember whether it was the Chinese or the North Vietnamese, badges of Sihanouk which were to be used and in order to win popular support during the war. This was at a time in which the Vietnamese were still present in Cambodia during the 1970 to 75 war. And it was the Pol Pot group which took the badges and threw them away because they didn't want too much credit for their successes to be attributed to Sihanouk.
I think I have time for just one last question today. So I would like you to comment upon something you wrote in your book. This is at ERN 01001774. You quote the Vietnamese leader Le Duan as having called the existing system in Cambodia at that time, the DK, quote, slave-holding communism, unquote. Can you tell us what he meant by that in your interpretation?
Well, that I think what he understood was that the system of party control of society was so onerous, with people not paid for their work except in food and an insufficient amount of food, that it was a form of slavery rather than the kind of communism that existed in Vietnam. Some of these issues are matters of degree, of course, but the situation in Cambodia was very extreme, of course, in 75 to 78.
Thank you, Mr. President.
President, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Expert. It is now convenient time for the adjournment. The Chamber will resume its hearing tomorrow, 20 October 2016 at 9 a.m. Tomorrow, the Chamber continue to hear the testimony of Mr. Expert Stephen Morris. Thank you, Mr. Stephen Morris. The hearing of your testimony as an expert has not yet concluded. You are therefore invited to come back tomorrow at 9 a.m. Court officer, in collaboration with VISU, please make necessary transport arrangement to send the expert, Morris, to where he is staying and invite him back to the courtroom tomorrow at 9 a.m. Security personnel are instructed to bring Khieu Sampon and Nguyen Chie back to the detention facility and have them returned to the courtroom tomorrow morning before 9 a.m. The court is now adjourned.